Welcome to Kent Hance, the best storyteller in Texas podcast. You can find us online at hancepodcast.com, and we would love to hear from you via email. Send your email to info@hancepodcast.com. Please like and subscribe to this podcast and share it with your friends on social media. Chancellor Hance, get us started with the saying of the day.
The saying of the day is, the way I see it, if you want the rainbow, you got to put up with the rain. That's Dolly Parton. Mm-hmm. And she's famous for singing, but that's pretty good. You know, you got to put up with some stuff that may be a little tough to get that rainbow. Sandy, there's a big case that's in front of the Supreme Court right now, and it's called the Chevron case. Back in almost 30 years ago, a case was made, and it was on a Chevron case that if the federal government was having trouble interpreting the law, that the interpretation of the federal agency would be and could be a deciding factor. And a lot of people, including myself, wish that that was not true because you're giving a tremendous amount of power to the federal agencies. And so if you hear about the Chevron case, and I think most people don't know about it, if you hear about it, that's a case where if it's reversed, that means the federal agencies are going to have less power to interpret laws. And that what it will do, it'll put a lot more pressure on members of Congress that they're going to have to come back and clarify some laws. So I think it's a good thing if it's reversed and that they move forward without it and without letting the federal agencies be the determining factor on what something actually means.
So just so we understand, is it a law that the federal government has written, but then they say to the agencies, y'all interpret it how you want?
Right.
Okay.
They've written a law, and then they allow if there's some discretion or if there's some cloudiness in it, and people don't know exactly what parts of it mean and everything, they leave that up to the courts, and the courts leave it up to the federal agencies to make a decision on it. I know some of the business people say, well, they've won a few battles that way. Well, you know, they may, but I bet you they've lost more than they've won. And that this is a case that I hope is overturned, and they go back to saying it's got to be the interpretation of the court on what the federal government's saying, not the federal agency.
A much lighter note, did you happen to see, I saw this story and I immediately thought, I wonder what Chancellor Hance would do if he were on an airplane when there was a snake.
Golly, you know, I read that story, and there was a snake. It was a flight out of Bangkok, and there was a snake, and it was crawling from overhead bin to overhead bin. You know, I mean, don't you think everybody's looking up thinking, golly, where is he going to come out next? Mm-hmm. And they were able to, one of the flight attendants captured it. And I tell you, the only thing worse of having a snake in the bins in a commercial airline is to have a snake on a small private plane. You know, you don't have a lot of room to get out. I mean, you're going to be saying, land it, wherever you go, you know, do something. We had a guy in Dimmitt one time and had he went down to a little lake there, Playa Lake, and caught a bunch of snakes. And one of his buddies drove by and said, "What do you got in the barrel?" They had a barrel full of snakes. It's about it's a 55-gallon drum, and it's about 2/3 full of snakes just trying to get out and everything. It is rough looking. And they put a wooden handle of a hoe down in there. Those snakes wrapped around it, and they pitched it in his back seat. And old Honey, he took off driving, and he drove about a block, and he got out and started throwing snakes out of his car and everything. And so he came back and cussed them out pretty good and threatened to whip them. And about a week later, he had a date, and she was sitting fairly close to him, and she went, "Oh," and grabbed his arm, and he thought, man, she must really like me and everything. Looked down, and a snake had crawled around her shoes. Ooh. So he didn't get all those snakes. He said he told us that I killed all 8 of those snakes, and we didn't tell him. on it, there were 9. But it made for an exciting date. I think she never did go out with it.
I'd have lit that car on fire and walked away.
Yeah.
Just knowing that one might still be there. Ugh, not something I want. Another kind of interesting headline, and I know that you saw this, Capitol Police investigated over 8,000 threats against lawmakers.
Yeah. You get threats, and 99.9% of them probably are just, almost fictitious. I mean, they get mad, and most of your threats on your answering machine will come in between about midnight and 2 in the morning. Mm-hmm. They've had a little fire water, and they're going to call and threaten their congressman. And you can go to prison. You can go to jail over it. I had one time in my life, and I was in Big Spring, Texas, and I made a speech, and the guy came up, and I was going in to make a speech. And the guy said, "Are you Kent Hance?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And I put my hand out to shake hands. He didn't shake hands. And he said, "Well, I'm here to whip you. My wife was cheating on me when I was in Korea eating bologna." And I said, "I don't know you, and I don't know your wife either. What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, the military retirement." And I'd passed a bill that said if you get a divorce and say the spouse was entitled to some of the retirement, if you've been married and you get a divorce and 20 years of it you were in the military, you're entitled to your percent in this state, in most states. And what would happen, the guy wouldn't send them a check. He'd get the check from the Pentagon and for the retirement, and that'd be it. And you'd have to go back and take them to court again, threaten to put them in jail to get your part. So I passed a bill that allowed you in a divorce to get a copy of the divorce, and if you're entitled to a certain percent of the retirement, then you send it to the Pentagon, and they cut 2 checks, one to you and one to your spouse, which makes sense. Mm-hmm. And that way everybody gets, but he didn't want her getting anything, and he was going to whip me. And so I said quickly, I said, before you hit me, you need to realize that Congress passes the laws on assault on a member of Congress, and they're going to be tough, and it's 20 years to hit a member of Congress. Now, if you want to go spend 20 years in prison, then get after it. And I turned around and walk away thinking he probably hit me in the back of the head. But he didn't. I appealed to his senses, and that George Miller, a congressman from California, he had a guy get up on the roof of a little place where he was having a town hall meeting and jumped off the roof on George's back. And I think the judge went light on it and gave him 12 years. 12 years for jumping on somebody's back. That's pretty tough. But those judges, they're not, if you hit a member of Congress, they're not going to be easy on you. The members write the laws, mm-hmm. and they write the salaries for the judges. So if you get carried away and had too much to drink, you want to threaten somebody, don't threaten a picture, but don't be calling people and tell them you're going to do, crazy things.
Are you, as a congressman, are you provided any type of security?
The leadership in Congress is the House and the Senate leaders. They have with them, like Cornyn, when he was minority leader and majority, he was minority whip and majority whip. He always had at least 2, sometimes 3 security people. And the security people they have are from the Capitol Police. Mm-hmm. And like when he stopped being the whip, then he went back without security. You can request it if you need it. Now, I had alcohol and tobacco and firearms people came to see me after I got elected to Congress, and they said, "We'll provide you security." And I said, "I don't need security." And they had they got us in a position. They said, if you make a speech at a town hall meeting and people know and you put in the newspaper where you're going to be, then if somebody shows up with a gun and starts shooting, they're going to do a lot of damage before the police can get there. And if we're there, then we can distract them and try to stop it. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay. And they never did. They always came to my town hall meetings. And one time, I went to a town hall meeting in a little town, and I had 3 guys from, protecting me, and I had 2 people show up to listen. In politics, it
only takes one though.
It'll give you some humility. Sometimes you'll have a deal, and everybody's been nice to you and going out of the way to tell you you're doing a great job and everything like. You'll have some event and 2 people show up. One, my record was 1 in Andrews, Texas. And
that the guy you got the picture made in the newspaper with?
Yeah, I got and later, I always, his name was Dan Newbro, and I always remember if he called me, I always took his call. He showed up when it wasn't easy, when it was almost impossible to get people to show up. Talking about security, when I worked for Governor Preston Smith, they had security sometime, like if he's going somewhere, but they didn't have security all the time. Well, the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, speaker, they all have security now, and should. But I know, and I've mentioned this before. One time I was driving the governor to La Mesa, and it was the governor and his top strategy guy, Otis Green. And we were rocking along, and the governor kept going faster, we're running late, we got to make up time, get faster. I was up about 90, 95, and I looked up in the mirror, and here he came. And he pulled us over, and I said, what's the hurry? And I said, the governor's running late to make a speech, and I've got him here, and officer, DPS guy looked down in there, and he said, well, hello, Governor, how are you? And the governor said, doing fine. We are running a little late. He said, I told him not to be driving so fast. And I went, no, I didn't say anything. I just thought, you just threw me under the bus. And so he told us to be careful, and he let us go, and we headed on. He went back the other way to O'Donnell. He didn't want to catch us twice, I think, in one day. And so we went about 5 miles. Nobody said anything. And the governor finally said, look, if I'd told him, hey, I told him to drive fast and you need to let us go right now and everything, he'd probably done it. But he'd gone back and told everybody in the courthouse, and it wouldn't look good. But if he knew I was trying to slow you down, well, it worked out for best. Worked out best for you and him and me and everybody. Mm-hmm. I just kept on driving. I was back up to about 90. We got there, and he made a great speech, and everything went well. But
you mentioned leadership in Congress, and who was the guy that when you were a freshman came up and asked if you were going to the party tonight?
That was in the state Senate.
State Senate. Okay.
It was Senator Peyton McKnight from Tyler, and Senator McKnight was an Aggie, and he ran around with Senator Bill Moore, who was an Aggie, and they were a couple of characters. They were hilarious, and if they wanted to kill a bill, it was dead. I mean, they knew how to kill bills. Mm-hmm. And Senator Moore used to say, people sent me up here to help the Aggies and kill bills. But Senator McKnight came over to me, and he said, you going over the deal at the governor's mansion tonight? I'd been a senator less than 2 months, and I went, I don't know anything about it. He said, I guess they just invited the leadership, and turned around and walked off. Okay. I'm learning.
A little hazing.
I'm catching on. Senator Moore, there was a bill that passed over in the House, and it did away with any restrictions on church schools or church adoption centers. And it did away with fire, health, everything. And there was a preacher down at Corpus, I'm trying to think his name, and he was the one that pushed it through. He had a big radio program at the time. And one of the persons, Mac McAllister, was state representative, good guy, good state representative. He owned a TV station in Lubbock, and he called me. He said, Senator, we had a bad bill get loose, and it's headed over there, and y'all got to kill it. it does away with any safety, health, any kind of standards for a religious reform school or a religious school, just a regular school. And y'all got to kill that thing. And I said, now, how'd you vote? And he said, well, I voted for it, but I got a bunch of people in the district who were writing me for it. And I said, well, I represent the same district you know, I'm senator. I got a little larger area, and I laughed. And anyway, we had a meeting in the lieutenant governor's office, and we were talking about how to kill it, and nobody wanted to take a vote on it. It was controversial, and it was a bad bill. And Senator Moore said to the lieutenant governor, he said, Governor, A&M needs and I don't remember what it was, a veterinary science or engineering, a new building, you know. And, it's really important. And I don't have the support for it that I need. I don't have enough votes here in the Senate. And can we get that done? Well, you know, we were talking about that bill, that bad old bill, and Senator Tom Creighton from Mineral Wells said, we just bought a building. And what Moore was saying is, I'll kill that bill if y'all, you know, take care of the building that A&M needs. Mm-hmm. And he got a lot of buildings built over at A&M. And so the bill, Lester Roloff, that was the preacher's name, and he came up for a hearing, and they had a last guy testify, was preacher, and he said the House had our prayers and they passed this bill. The governor had our prayers and he's going to sign the bill, and the Senate's got our prayers and to pass this bill. And Senator Moore said, you know, the House may have had your prayers and the governor may have your prayers, but your bill doesn't have a prayer because I'm sending it to a subcommittee to die. And said, the meeting adjourned, got up and left. And boy, I mean, everybody stayed to shock. And there was a senator from Houston seated next to me. One of the preachers is involved in this with Lester Roloff came around over and said, what happened? What happened? He said, I don't know, but I was with you 100% of the way, you know. And sometimes things happen in legislation that you don't understand. But if you're a business person, you don't. I'm not even talking if you're real big business. If you go buy a car, when you go in and they say it's $40,000, you say okay. No, you start bargaining with them, and that happens a lot in legislation. That you got to give and take. Big issue coming up is on keeping the government open. That in March there's going to be a big issue, and that Speaker Johnson is saying that if we don't secure the border in America, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California, then we're not going to be helping Ukraine. And most of the Democrats really want to help Ukraine, and so. That will be, you know, if the speaker stays by that and says, we're just not passing a bill to extend the government unless you vote to have meaningful reform and stop the wide open borders. And so that's a fight to watch, and it'll be a real test to see how Johnson does as speaker. If he doesn't win that battle, he might be like Kevin McCarthy, he might fall by the wayside.
And they could stop the immigration pretty quickly, right?
They opened it up real quick. They can shut it real quick.
Do you miss being in that environment, the mixing it up part?
I think I always enjoyed that part of it. There are other parts you didn't. But I always enjoyed, like when I carried Reagan's tax cut, we had an idea, and we went to him and said, look, one of the things that I've got to have in the tax cut is doing away with the windfall profits tax on stripper oil wells, that oil wells that had 10 barrels a day or less. And it makes sense. They shouldn't. You wanted to keep them from having to pay the additional tax on it so they could operate. You know, a oil well that's producing 2 barrels a day or 10 barrels a day, that's not much. and there's not much profit there, and there shouldn't be a windfall profits tax on any of it. And we were able to get the administration. President Reagan said that sounds reasonable to me.
Right. Did you have to give anything up for that? Was there just President said?
Well, that was a deal that we'd had before then. The year before, we were trying to get rid of that, and that most of the Texas delegation voted for the Chrysler bailout, which was one of the great votes of all time in Congress, because they made $267 million on it in less than 3 years.
Recap people on that, what that was.
That was a deal that Chrysler was going broke, and they needed a loan from the government. And Lee Iacocca, that was CEO and chairman of the board of Chrysler, called my office, and they wanted an appointment. And I, of course, saw him, and all my Chrysler dealers were saying, this, we're going to have to lay off people. I mean, this is a bad situation. And he came in to see me, met with me and Charlie Wilson. And Charlie was a deal maker. Charlie was always on top of things. And Charlie said, Hance has been fighting. He represents Midland, Odessa, and Lubbock, and he's been fighting that windfall profits tax. We need to get some kind of commitment out of the delegation from Michigan that they're going to help us get rid of that windfall profits tax. And Iacocca said, that's reasonable. And so he set up a meeting, and we met with some of the leaders of the Michigan delegation, and they agreed to do it, and they followed through with it the next year. And we were able to keep the windfall profits tax from being taxed on the stripper wells, small operators. And that a stripper well, 10 barrels or less, well, there were a few probably that may have had 100, stripper wells that were producing $5 barrels a day. And it certainly helped them, but it was a penalty. It was the only time in the history of mankind that there's been a reverse tariff. And what it was a tax on oil produced in the United States, and it exempted oil coming in from Saudi Arabia, Venezuela. So if you were bringing oil into your refinery and you were from another country, you didn't have to pay the tax, the so-called windfall profits tax. But if you were out in Levelland, Texas, and had a well that was producing 10 barrels a day or whatever, you had to pay a tax on it. But it was a reverse tariff. It was a reverse tax. It was, in effect, just saying, if you produce in the United States, we're going to tax you. We'll show you. And if you produce in Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, you're exempt. And it was one of those deals that passed, and people were, gasoline prices had gotten high, and they were mad at the oil companies. No, that wasn't a solution.
Right.
When they deregulated natural gas prices had been set by the government, and they deregulated them, and natural gas prices were anywhere from $6 to $12 MCF. And within 2 years, the average price was around $1.65.
Funny.
And that was, the consumer benefited on that.
You mentioned the bailout, the Chrysler bailout, and most Americans today have a bad taste in their mouth about government bailouts, but that's a really good reminder that some of them work out.
So you've got to look at it, and you don't want to get government in the everyday business. But that was one that the price we're going to have to pay for unemployment benefits, for food stamps, for everything was going to be enormous. And Iacocca, he just laid out his game plan and what he would do and how they were going to make it. And I never see a round pickup, you see them everywhere, that you don't think about Lee Iacocca and the vote on that. And we kept them in business, and they kept paying taxes.
Thank you very much for listening. We do appreciate it, and we would love to hear from you. Send email to info@hancepodcast.com. Follow us on Instagram @BestStorytellerPodcast, and scroll through our past episodes too. They include interviews with Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, Governor Rick Perry, Ben Ferguson, and more. Chancellor, will you wrap it up with the saying of the day?
The saying of the day was, the way I see it, if you want the rainbow, you got to put up with the rain. And that was Dolly Parton.